It is my privilege and my honor to introduce to you Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros. For the 2017-2018 academic year, Augusto Lopez-Claros is on leave from the World Bank as a senior fellow at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Between 2011 and 2017, he was the director of the World Bank's Global Indicators Group. Previously, he was chief economist and director of the Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. Before leaving the forum, he worked for several years in the financial sector in London. He was the International Monetary Fund's resident representative in the Russian Federation during the 1990s. In 2007, he was co-editor of the publication entitled The International Monetary System, the IMF, and the G20, A Great Transformation in the Making. Recent publications include Removing Impediments to Sustainable Economic Development, The Case of Corruption in 2015. Fiscal Challenges After the Global Financial Crisis, a survey of key issues in 2014. And The Moral Dimension of the Fight Against Corruption, 2017. Before joining the IMF, Dr. Lopez-Claros was a professor of economics at the University of Chile in Santiago. He was educated in England and in the United States. He received a diploma in mathematical statistics from Cambridge University and a PhD in economics from Duke University. He is a much sought-after international speaker, having lectured in the last several years at some of the world's leading universities and think tanks. We are indeed fortunate to have him with us this evening. Please welcome Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm going to take my watch off and put it here because I want to respect the time limit given to me by the organizers. Normally, or sometimes, I have my wife sitting in the audience, and she will signal to me when I am going beyond the time limit. We have this very easy communication, and I usually obey her commands. You know, my friends, it occurs to me that the last 50 years has seen a process of great transformation in the making in the world. You know, I remember living in the early 1980s, very much in a period that was characterized as the Cold War. And it's interesting to compare that period, the period that followed the end of World War II and the next several decades, and the age in which we live today. And if you allow me, I will sort of elaborate a little bit on this subject. You know, the perspective of the 1970s and 1980s, particularly when we were living under the Cold War, was very much of a world divided in two opposing camps. One camp represented by the Soviet Union and its satellites and its allegiance to central planning and communism, and the other camp represented by the United States and the developed democracies of the West, very much identified with democracy and the free market. But that world is largely gone. With the end of the Cold War, the world is no longer divided in these two ideological camps. And in fact, today, if we had to characterize the age in which we live, we would say that we live in an age of integration. These two phases had their own symbols. During the Cold War, the symbol was the Iron Curtain. It was the Berlin Wall. In fact, very often when we try to pin down when did the Cold War come to an end, we often think of 1989, which is when the Berlin Wall was taken down, brick by brick. Today, our symbol is the internet. It is the latest technologies which are actually bringing nations and peoples together. In fact, these two ages had their own particular technologies. Back in the 1980s, when I was sort of a young PhD student at the university, the way that one measured the strength of the Cold War system is basically by the strength and the destructive power of nuclear weapons, and by the all associated technologies associated with the military-industrial complex. But today, the technologies and the way in which we measure the technological prowess of the present age has to do more with communication, with fiber optics, with the latest technologies that have been developed and that are changing the world as we speak. And then finally, these two periods of history had their own particular anxieties as well. In the early 1980s, I remember very well that the prevailing anxiety was that of nuclear annihilation. It was the fear that at some point the United States and the Soviet Union would resolve some kind of major conflict through the use of nuclear weapons, and then humanity might be extinguished. Or if not, that we would enter into a period of great suffering and instability. The anxiety in today's age is no longer, or at least not to the same extent, nuclear annihilation. The anxiety today is perhaps being left behind by the system. The age of globalization has brought about its own particular challenges, and one of these challenges is that people increasingly feel somehow detached from the system, that the world is changing at such speed and in such a way that your skills and that may no longer be adequate to the task of integrating into an increasingly complex global economy. You know that the idea of globalization, although has become relatively recent phenomena, is actually very much present in the Baha'i writings. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you a short passage from a letter that was written by Abdul Baha, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, to a lady in Scotland in the year 1906. Abdul Baha was a prolific writer, and he would be in communication with Baha'is all over the world. In 1906, he was the head of the Baha'i community because his father, Baha'u'llah, had passed away years before. And in this role of encouraging the community and being in contact, he would write substantial messages. And in this particular letter to Mary Elizabeth White in Scotland, he says the following. He says, in cycles gone by, that is, in the distant past, owing to the absence of means, the unity of mankind could not have been achieved. And then he goes on and explains that in the distant past, because of lack of appropriate means of transport and communication, even the concept of world unity or the unity of mankind would have been foreign, would have been not something that people could relate to. Then he goes on to say, in this day, however, and this is remembered, 1906, in this day, however, means of communication have multiplied, and all the members of the human family have become increasingly interdependent. The bonds of industry and trade, of agriculture and education are being strengthened every day. This, by the way, is very much a definition of what we mean by globalization. He doesn't use the word, but it is a description of what we mean by globalization. Interdependence and progress in the field of communication and so on. Then he continues, hence, because of this, because of the growing degree of interdependence, the unity of mankind can in this day be achieved. Verily, this is none other but one of the wonders of this wondrous age, this glorious century. This century, the century of light, has been endowed with unique and unprecedented glory, power, and illumination. Eventually, he continues, it will be seen how bright its candles will burn in the assemblage of man. To Baha'is, this tablet written by Abdul Baha to Mary Elizabeth White is very often referred to as the tablet of the candles of unity, because then, as he proceeds, he explains to her the different levels of unity that will be achieved in the future. And in particular, and he refers to 7 levels of unity. I will not tell you what these seven levels of unity are, but I will refer to one of them. He refers to one of the candles being the unity of nations, a unity which in this century will be securely established, causing all the peoples of the world to regard themselves as citizens of one common fatherland. This is a very powerful statement, and what I wanted to point out to you in particular is this statement that this unity of nations will be securely established in the 20th century, because this was written in 1906, and therefore he's referring to the 20th century. And it's interesting to speculate and to think out loud, can we claim that in some sense in the 20th century we have established as a fact on the face of the earth this idea of being part of a human family, being part of a community of nations where we are all brothers and sisters, beyond the fact that some of us are French and some of us are Argentinians and some of us are Chinese. And in this respect, I'd like to share with you just a couple of insights. You know that the 20th century saw the creation in 1945 of the United Nations and the UN Charter. And the United Nations was an attempt on the part of the international community to deal with the after effects of World War II. 60 million people perished in that conflict. It is referred to as a world war because that is what it was. It involved raping and pillage and destruction on a grand scale. And yet, in 1945, the nations of the world came together in San Francisco and they endorsed the UN Charter, which firmly establishes, read the UN Charter, firmly establishes this concept of common brotherhood of man. In 1948, we signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Universal Declaration actually has statements in it that say things like, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. So it is clear that in the 20th century we saw the development of momentous events that firmly established this idea of the brotherhood of man, this idea of a common citizenship and a common origin. As Baha'u'llah would have said, you are the fruits of one tree, you are the leaves of one tree, you are the drops of one ocean. But perhaps the most significant development in this area took actually place in the year 2000, at the tail end of the 20th century. And I'd just like to mention this to you because it is something that is, I think, of fundamental importance, and it is something that we don't particularly focus on. The year 2000 led to the announcement by the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of a scientific undertaking that had been ongoing for a number of years called the mapping of the human genome. In the year 2000, President Clinton in the United States and Prime Minister Tony Blair in the United Kingdom decided to declare the work of two teams that had been working on these two countries, to declare that process a tie. It had been a race for a while, and in a very honorable way they decided, okay, the mapping of the human genome has been completed and we're going to announce this jointly. And Craig Ventier, who was the head of the American team, made a speech where he said the following. He said, one of the first questions that we wanted to analyze after concluding this scientific work was, what is the meaning of race? Is race a concept that has a scientific underpinning, or is it largely a cultural construct? And he said that what we did is we looked at two individuals coming from two different races. You can think of blue-eyed, blonde-haired white Swedish male and a black curly-haired Nigerian. And we ask ourselves, what percent of the gene pool do we actually need to explain the differences between these two very different individuals on the basis of which we say that they come from two different races? And the answer to this question was, we need approximately 100 of 1% of the genes that these individuals have in common. In other words, these two individuals are 99.99% the same. They have the same genetic information, the same gene structure. And Professor Bentier's conclusion was, therefore, there is only one race, the human race. But of course, Baha'is who hear that will immediately recognize the wonderful words of the founder of the Baha'i faith in the 19th century when he said, the earth is but one mankind, the earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. Right? So in a sense, at the tail end of the 20th century, we had scientific confirmation that in fact we are one human family. And what we are going through now and in succeeding decades is basically a gradual awakening and an increase in our awareness of something that, as I was growing up as a child, I thought was a noble sentiment, but I never thought was actually a scientific statement. When Baha'u'llah said, the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens, he wasn't just stating a noble principle of human brotherhood, he was also stating apparently a scientific statement, a scientific truth. Right? And that is most important and most noteworthy. Something else that we have witnessed in the post-war period, I would say in the last 50 years, is the emergence of a gradual system of universally accepted values. You know, we tend to make much of human differences. I've already told you we should make nothing of racial differences because they don't exist. They are simply illusions. They have no scientific underpinning. But nevertheless, we make much of other differences between members of the human family. And yet, we don't often notice that gradually, over the last half a century, we have seen the emergence of a set of universal human values. People everywhere, regardless of their religious background, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their social class, regardless of whether they're men or women, rich or poor, believe that we should live in a world of peace and nonviolence. People everywhere believe that we should live in a world in which we have a certain degree of economic security. Everybody wants to be certain that there will be food on the table on the following day. And this is regardless of whether you're a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Baha'i. Everybody wants to live in a world in which we have social justice, where there is a law that applies uniformly to all. We don't have a law for the rich and the wealthy and another set of laws for the poor and the underprivileged. Social justice is something that we share in common across cultures, across countries, across all kinds of groups. We all want to know that we live in a world characterized by ecological stability. Mothers want to know that the water that their children are drinking do not have lead and are not going to result in mental retardation. And that is independent of whether the mother is a Muslim in Algeria or a Protestant in Sweden. Or a Hindu in India. And these are very, very fundamental values, and they are a very strong foundation for building for the future. That's for sure. We Baha'is believe that the next several decades are going to see momentous changes in the economic and the political reorganization of our planet. We live in a world in which we are facing a whole set of global challenges which cannot be solved outside of a mechanism of international cooperation. You know, think of the problem of climate change. Climate change now has become a global problem. It is a concern of the international community. And yet we don't have the institutions and the mechanisms to actually help us address this problem in an effective way. And so In the Baha'i faith, there is this vision of global order, this vision that in the future, because of interdependence, because of the processes of integration which were identified by Abdul Baha in that message to Mary Elizabeth White in 1906, we will have to develop mechanisms of international cooperation. We will see the emergence of global institutions which are actually going to lead eventually to the establishment of mechanisms of global governance. Baha'u'llah referred to this process, and I'd like to share with you a quote from his writings, which is very pertinent to these processes. He said, "The day is approaching when we will have rolled up the world and all that is therein, and spread out a new order in its stead. He verily is powerful over all things. The world's equilibrium hath been upset through the vibrating influence of this most great, this new world order. Mankind's order life hath been revolutionized through the agency of this unique, this wondrous system, the like of which world eyes have never witnessed." You know, I was introduced to you as an economist, and that is true. I am an economist by training and by profession and by vocation, it seems to me. And I often think of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, as having been, among other things, a very good economist as well. And I want to give you an anecdote and to explain to you why I mean this. As some of you may know, Baha'u'llah was a captive and a prisoner during the last 28 years of his life in what today is the State of Israel, but what in the 19th century was part of the Ottoman Empire. And in 1890, 2 years before he passed away, he was visited in prison by a noted scholar from Cambridge University, Edward Brown. Edward Brown was a professor of an Orientalist. He spoke Arabic and Persian fluently. He had been traveling in the region and was intimately familiar with the culture of that part of the world. Well, he visited Baha'u'llah in what then was called Palestine. And in the course of these conversations, Baha'u'llah lamented the fact that Europe in particular was on a war footing, that was preparing, for the next global cataclysm, which was World War I. And in the course of the discussions, he said the following to Brown. He said, "However, we see your kings and rulers expending their treasures more in means for the destruction of the human race than in that which would confer happiness to humanity." This is the economist thinking. He's looking at resources, limited resources that governments have at their disposal, and he is regretting deeply the fact that governments, instead of spending those resources in that which would conduce happiness to mankind, i.e. education, public health, and development, are actually using those resources to build machines for the destruction of humankind. And that is very much an economist's way of thinking. And indeed, in a series of letters that he wrote a few years before to the kings and rulers of the world, Queen Victoria in Great Britain, the Tsar in Russia, the Emperor in Germany, and so on, he addresses this particular issue, and he says that the responsibility of leaders is fundamentally to care for the downtrodden, to care for the disadvantaged, to use scarce resources, to narrow the gap between those that have a lot and those that don't have very much. Right? Why is this important? Why is this issue that Baha'u'llah raised with Edward Brown of fundamental importance? Because, he argued, as we redirect resources away from warfare and destruction and other kinds of inefficient ways, and we redirect them to human development, we will see the beginning of a new phase in the development of mankind, where there will be a flourishing of human capacities, and where human beings will achieve things and reach stages of development never before seen in the history of mankind. Indeed, he says the following. He says, "The heights which, through the most gracious favor of God, mortal man can attain in this day are as yet unrevealed in his sight. The world of being hath never had, nor does it yet possess the capacity for such a revelation. The day, however, is approaching," he says, "when the potentialities of so great a favor will, by virtue of his behest, be manifested unto man." We Baha'is have very, very positive, very optimistic view of the long-term future of mankind. We may have a bumpy ride along the way, but eventually we will enter into a period of unsurpassed development and progress, where the potentialities latent in the human brain and in the capacity of individuals is going to be released in all its splendors. Let me conclude by sharing with you a passage from the writings of the head of the Baha'i community in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, Shoghi Effendi, referring to this particular period in the evolution of mankind. He said, "Then will a world civilization be born and perpetuate itself, a civilization with a fullness of life such as the world has never seen nor can as yet conceive. Then will the promise enshrined in all the books of God be redeemed, and the prophecies uttered by the prophets of old come to pass, and the vision of seers and poets be realized." More poetic, more beautiful, more positive than that, it cannot possibly get.